Less than a week ago, in the early morning hours of August 2nd, Iraqi armed forces, without provocation or warning, invaded a peaceful Kuwait. Iraq's tanks stormed in blitzkrieg fashion. With more than 100,000 troops, along with tanks, artillery, and surface-to-surface missiles, Iraq now occupies Kuwait. The acquisition of territory by force is unacceptable, and no one should underestimate our determination to confront aggression.
In 1990, George Bush successfully used the UN and his strong diplomatic abilities not only to unite many countries that were reluctant to join a war, but to also gain the support of a largely democratic Congress and the American public. This choice to use force against aggression set a precedent for U.S. policy for years to come. Under the War Powers Act, the power to go to war is divided between the President and the Congress. According to the Act, the President can use force without congressional approval for only 60 days. Although Bush was aware that he did not need congressional approval to use force, it is desirable to have a united government in order to unify the country and to become a stronger power. The decision that President Bush and Congress had to make was between continuing the sole use of sanctions or using force and sanctions to drive Iraq out of Kuwait. There were many underlying historical factors contributing to the decisions that had to be made. One of these factors stemmed from the Vietnam War, called the Vietnam Syndrome.
Another important factor was how terrible one thought the war was going to be, okay? And a lot of the people who were strongly opposed to the use of force and very supportive of sanctions were afraid there would be thousands and thousands tens of thousands of American casualties, and Saddam would use chemical weapons. It would become a quagmire.
This made people weary of using force in overseas conflicts. A more distant past event that supported the use of force was the Munich Pact. This attempt to avoid war was called appeasement and allowed Hitler to become more powerful and start World War II. As President Bush said, "If history teaches us anything, it is that we must resist aggression, or it will destroy our freedoms. Appeasement does not work." Another factor which supported the use of force was the history of economic sanctions. Many sanctions enacted by the United States as early as 1807 had yielded limited and detrimental results. Sanctions were not only unsuccessful in persuading the target country, they were harmful to the nation's people.
I think that's the main argument about the sanctions, that they generally don't force nations to change their mind. They very often end up punishing the population.
These underlying historical circumstances were the factors that created the debate in Congress and the context for President Bush's decision that force was the best resolution. On October 30th, 1990, Bush had a decisive meeting with cabinet members to discuss the possible plans dealing with the Kuwait crisis. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Colin Powell, introduced two new plans concerning actions in Iraq. The more appealing of the two described an invasion where the U.S. would have to use more ground troops and force Iraq out of Kuwait. After considering all of the factors, the president simply said, "Do it."
Sanctions were not really a major option. As far as the president was concerned, this was a matter of principle of aggression, the sort of thing that the United Nations had been formed to prevent. And he felt that the international community cannot just stand by and allow this raw aggression to take place against an innocent nation like Kuwait. So the idea of turning the Iraqis back by sanctions was never a major player in the mind of the administration.
With a clear itinerary in hand, the next step was for Bush and the cabinet to create a coalition. From the Iraqi point of view, the United States had organized a conspiracy with Kuwait in undercutting the Iraqi oil exports. According to Iraqi Foreign Minister Tariq Aziz, Iraq had no choice, either to be destroyed or attack the enemy on the outside. Iraqi leaders felt that Kuwait was overproducing oil and it was hurting Iraq. When the Emir of Kuwait did not give in to Saddam's demands to stop, the Iraqis said they would invade unless Kuwait paid them $10 billion. Saddam felt he was able to give an ultimatum because he did not fear much U.S. involvement. He believed that the Vietnam Syndrome would discourage U.S. leaders from taking military action. Bush felt more comfortable with foreign policy than with domestic policy. He based his style in international affairs on personal relationships with leaders and diplomats. This personal touch was beneficial in gaining allies and the loyalty of other world leaders. Japan was fearful that heavy sanctions would damage its economy. However, Japan agreed to support the embargo after a personal call from Bush to Japan's Prime Minister Kai-fu and a stockpile of 142 days' supply of oil. Getting the support of countries surrounding Iraq was also important because military strikes would have to be conducted from all sides to ensure victory. Bush sought numerous countries for support, mainly as a political move aimed at portraying Saddam as fighting the world, not just the U.S. Bush was able to set up bases in Turkey to provide rescue forces for pilots shot down in northern Iraq. The U.S.'s biggest point of interest was Saudi Arabia. Two of Bush's advisors, Cheney and General Schwarzkopf, went to Saudi Arabia to show King Fahd's satellite photos of Saddam's army on the border, ready to invade. Consequently, the king changed his mind and he allowed the U.S. military into Saudi Arabia. The diplomatic actions of the president and his cabinet to get UN support were very impressive. Secretary Baker traveled to over 200 meetings with foreign diplomats and was able to convince world powers Russia and China not to veto the resolution to use force. The final Security Council vote was 12-2 concerning Resolution 678, which authorized countries to use all means necessary to liberate Kuwait. By obtaining UN support, the president was able to create a large coalition of countries to fight alongside the U.S. President Bush then turned his focus to convincing Congress to declare war. Bush invited many congressional leaders to the White House in order to convince them that force was necessary in order to push Iraq out of Kuwait. He appealed to them by discussing the brutality of Hussein towards the Kuwaiti people and urged them to read the Amnesty International report, which outlined the atrocities.
You know, there were a lot of actions that the Iraqis took early weeks that certainly made them even more unpopular, made it easier to sell the case for international action.
What was said to have been the most important congressional meeting in 20 years took place from January 9th to January 12th.
As an instrument of foreign policy, the Mitchell-Nunn resolution is unambiguous in the message it sends. If we adopt this resolution, we're undercutting the President's position of leadership. We are undermining the work of the UN. We are contradicting the effort that has been undertaken by some 60 nations. We are discouraging our allies. We are encouraging Saddam Hussein, and we are virtually eliminating our last fleeting hope for peace.
We don't lose by keeping the economic stranglehold we now have on Iraq. We have an unprecedented coalition of the allies. Why lose sight of that? Why give up this enormous advantage that the United States has, something that in the post-war period we've never been able to do before? Why not do that? Mr. President, as I said before, let us make war the last resort. Do not make war the first resort.
The final vote for war was 52-47 in the Senate and 250-183 in the House, both in favor of Bush's proposal. Given that the Congress was predominantly Democratic, Bush did a great job in persuading them to support military intervention, a remarkable feat of diplomacy. On January 16th, the U.S. launched Desert Storm, which consisted of a massive aerial attack and an ensuing ground invasion. Success was achieved in a matter of days when Kuwait was liberated and the ceasefire was declared on February 28th.
And as president, I can report to the nation, aggression is defeated, the war is over.
This early ending to the war seemed like the best possible outcome, but there has been intense debate whether Bush should not have exited so soon. As a result, Saddam continued to rule Iraq with an iron fist, killing anyone who opposed his regime. He used chemical weapons when suppressing the Kurd uprising and leveled towns when putting down a Shia rebellion in the south. Saddam's dissolute behavior, combined with the threat that he may have weapons of mass destruction, ultimately provoked George W. Bush to declare war on Iraq. He eventually took down Saddam's dictatorship and used troops to stabilize the region, allowing the Iraqis to establish their own government. Had George H.W. Bush stayed in Iraq and removed Hussein from his regime, the Second War may not have been necessary. Years following Desert Storm, there were a number of cases involving veterans suffering from what is known as Gulf War syndrome. These servicemen and women started to experience symptoms presumably resulting from the exposure to chemical agents. Medical professionals have been unable to find the specific causes for the symptoms. After the end of the war, U.S. forces had a continued presence in Saudi Arabia for 5 years. This angered many Middle Eastern people, most notably a wealthy businessman named Osama bin Laden. Bin Laden used his power to create a terrorist organization named Al-Qaeda. On August 23, 1996, the terrorist leader declared a holy war against America. He claimed that the presence of American and coalition troops in Saudi Arabia was one of the worst catastrophes to befall the Muslims since the death of the Prophet. Terrorizing you while you are carrying arms in our land is a legitimate right and a moral obligation. There were many attacks, but the most devastating was on September 11, 2001, when planes crashed into the World Trade Center towers and 2,752 people died. The horrific acts of Al-Qaeda caused George W. Bush to declare a war on terror.
Our nation, this generation, will lift a dark threat of violence from our people and our future. We will rally the world to this cause by our efforts, by our courage. We will not tire, we will not falter, and we will not fail.
This war is significant because the basis behind it stems from the belief that foreign aggression will not be tolerated. This diplomacy of George H.W. Bush proved to the country that the world is not justified if acts of violence are endured without any repercussions. Congress's landmark decision to use force when dealing with the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait provided a standard in United States foreign affairs that continues in our world today.